Good evening. Before I get started today, I gotta make a retraction here from 2 weeks ago. Was it 2 weeks ago that we were here? So I had misspoken. I had said that when King Saul set the bride price for David for the hand in marriage for Michal, that he requested 1,000 foreskins. But Steve corrected me when I came off the platform. It's actually 100 foreskins. So I misspoke. So the way the story actually goes is they got 100 foreskins, and then they went back and got another 200 foreskins. So they tripled the bride price. So for the last 2 weeks, I've been struggling with, do I bring that up? Because it questions my integrity if I don't. But then if I do bring it up, you got me talking about foreskins from the pulpit again. But I decided my integrity is more important to me than your hang-ups about the male anatomy. So just to be clear, it was 100 foreskins followed by 200 foreskins for a total of 300 foreskins. There are 31,102 verses in the ESV Bible, and that's the one Steve memorized. But thank you for bringing that to my attention. Anyways, there you go. Well, we left off last week with King Saul and 3 of his sons that had perished, if you remember, at the hands of the Philistines at the Battle of Mount Gilboa. Saul had 4 sons, but 3 of them now have perished. And David, we have learned, was anointed by Samuel as the next king of Israel. But that was a private ceremony. That was David and his immediate family and the prophet Samuel. And Samuel has passed away now. He's died. And so there really is nobody who's witness to that who has any credibility. And David actually has no claim whatsoever to the throne. He's not related to Saul in any way. And he's not even of the same tribe. Remember, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and David is from the tribe of Judah. And so he doesn't have any claim to the throne whatsoever. But David is not only a great warrior, and he is a very astute politician, which we're going to find as we walk through the narrative here this morning. So to begin with, let's just take a look at 2 Samuel 1, and we'll look at the first 10 verses here, and that'll sort of set the stage for where we pick up from where we left off 2 weeks ago. So beginning in 2 Samuel 1, verses 1 through 10. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. And David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "Well, the people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." And then David said to the young man who told him, "Well, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man told him and said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw him, and he called out to me. And I answered him, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood behind him, and I killed him. because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord. Now, wait a minute. That doesn't follow the narrative that we talked about 2 weeks ago at all, doesn't it? If you remember, when we read 1 Samuel, that narrative told us that Saul had committed suicide, that he had fallen on his sword. And then in fact, he asked his armor bearer to take his life, but the armor bearer wouldn't do that because he wasn't going to kill an anointed king. So what's happening here? Well, we got to back up because we can't, obviously I'm doing an overview of the Old Testament. We're trying to get through the stories. I can't tell every jot and tittle that's given to us. But if we go back, you remember, first of all, to 1 Samuel, first of all, remember that the city of Ziklag was given to David by the king of the Philistines. You remember that? When David went into exile and when they finally realized that he had defected from the Israelites, he gave him that city as his stronghold. And so while David was out on raids and, doing what David did on behalf of the Philistines, then his wives and his children and the wives and the children of his mighty men and all his army, they all would be in this Ziklag. His mother and his father, remember, he took them to Moab to be safe. But his immediate family's with him, and so are the families of the people who've come out to be with him. And so one time while he's out doing his raid, Ziklag got raided by the Amalekites. They burned a lot of the city, they looted it, and they took all the inhabitants hostage. And so when David returned and found out what had happened, he pursues the Amalekites, engages them in battle, and he reclaims all of his people, kills a bunch of them, and takes them back to Ziklag. But 400 of them escaped by camel. Has anybody ever been to Israel or any place where they had camels? I can't imagine. I'm having a hard time imagining escaping on a camel. Are camels fast? I mean, they must be. I don't know. They must run. Are they pretty fast? Yeah. Well, there you go. So you got 400 of these guys, and they're on camels, and they just scatter, and they take off. Well, one of these guys ends up coming across, and they're not all going to stay together. They're going to scatter because they're afraid David's going to be in pursuit. One of these guys comes across the field where the battle of Gilboa had just taken place. And this is before the Philistines had come in to do whatever they're going to do and dismember bodies, and because they're taking care of their own wounded and doing their own thing before all that happens. And this guy comes upon the battlefield and thinks, man, I just hit the jackpot. So he goes down in there and he starts pilfering wallets and taking watches and jewelry and whatever he can find. And he comes across Saul. Well, first of all, he knows David wants to be king. David's not particularly fond of Amalekites. So this would be a really good way to get into David's best graces and maybe get yourself a position in the court. So he takes the crown from Saul's head, he takes the armlet from his arm, and he goes back to David with this story about he was the hero of the day. And remember, David wouldn't kill Saul. And so immediately after he hears this story, he orders his men to decapitate the Amalekite for killing Saul. So they lop off his head, and then he writes this great lament that begins in verse 19 about Saul and Jonathan. And you can read that lament. It's really one of the most heart-wrenching, even from the Psalms, it's probably one of the most heart-wrenching laments that you find in Scripture. And so not only does he write this, but he circulates it throughout Israel, and people read this, and it really does capture the heart of many who say, look, David really is loyal to Saul. I mean, obviously they've heard the stories about when he cut a piece of his robe and held it up from a distance and said, I could have killed you, but I didn't. They remember the stories where he snuck into the camp, and he took the water bottle and he took the spear and he held him up and said, I could have killed you, but I didn't. And so those stories are circulating, and now they see this story of this great lament that David writes. Well, in chapter 2, when we get to the next chapter, David inquires of the Lord as to whether he should go back to Israel. So, because remember, this has got to be going through his head. He's been fighting as a mercenary on the Philistine side for 10 years. Now, he's never really done any harm to Israel. He's always raided other cities and made it look like he was raiding Israelite cities. But nevertheless, the people know that he's under the protection of the Philistines. So he inquires of the Lord as to, well, should I go back? Should I wait? What do I do? And the Lord says, no, you can go back, but what you are to do is you're to go to the city of Hebron, which is right in the center of Judah. Hebron is sort of like the capital of Judah, as Lansing would be the capital of Michigan, right? It's sort of the hub of where the tribe is administrated from. So David goes to Hebron, and they have received the lament, and he's one of them. He's from the tribe of Judah, and immediately they crown him king of Judah. I say king, they don't really have the right to crown him king of Israel. They crown him king of just their tribe. He's really more like the tribal warlord, if you will. And so at that same time, while he's crowned there, Abner, who is the commander of Saul's army, he's the commander of all the Israelite army. He goes and he finds this young man named Ishbosheth, who is the fourth son of Saul. Now you got to wonder, 3 of Saul's sons died in battle. Where was Ishbosheth? I mean, he's not just a kid, but he's a bit of a coward. He's a wimp. He doesn't want anything to do with war. He sort of is in hiding. But Abner ain't no wimp. Abner is a strong personality who has a huge command persona and is very respected throughout Israel. Abner figures, Ishbosheth is the rightful heir to the throne. He's the son of the king, the only one that's alive. So Abner brings him forth to the other 11 tribes and says, well, here's your king. And Abner, I'm sure, is thinking, it's not a problem for me because I'll just run things from where I'm at, and this kid will do what I tell him to do. And so Ishbosheth becomes king of all of Israel, 11 tribes, 12 tribes if you included the tribe of Levi. And then David is the tribal leader or the king of Judah. And that goes on for a period of time until Joab. Now Joab, you remember, is the general of David's forces. He's been with him from the very beginning when he went into hiding. So Joab, who is the head of the forces in Judah, goes to see Abner, who's the head of the forces for the other 11 tribes, to have a summit of sorts. Because everybody realizes, well, this is not ideal. Judah is one of the largest tribes. It's a huge piece of property. So we ought to talk about this division. So Abner and Joab get together with a bunch of their representatives. Well, the summit doesn't go well. Swords are drawn, blood is spilled, and that enters into a big civil war where these two factions are just raiding one another and fighting on a regular basis. In the meantime, what happens during this period of time is Ishbosheth accuses Abner publicly of sleeping with one of his concubines. It wasn't really his concubine. Well, it was, but it was his father's concubine, but apparently you inherit those, so he has that concubine now. And so he accuses Abner of sleeping with this concubine. And Abner is so insulted that his integrity would be called into question that he thinks, enough of this nonsense, I'm not putting up with this guy. So he goes to David and he tells David, you know, I've had enough of this guy. If you guarantee me that you will make me the commander of all the Israelite forces, I am capable of bringing the loyalty of the other 11 tribes to you. Now, I said David's a pretty astute politician. So David says, well, all right, that's something I'm willing to think about, but, you know, how do I know I can really trust you? I'll tell you what, as a measure of good faith, why don't you bring my wife Michal back to me? Now, when I said that David had no right to the throne, the only thing that you could have said that maybe got his foot in the door a little bit was that he was married to Saul's youngest daughter, Michal. But when David went into hiding, Saul annulled that marriage, and she's married to somebody else and has been for near 10 years. So David says, I want you to go get her, and I want you to bring her back here because she's my wife. Now, he's got 2 other wives, and he may have had more by that time, I'm not sure. But I know for sure he had 2. And Michal is, you know, she's married to this other guy. They live in a nice house in the suburbs. She's got a couple of kids. She's a established soccer mom. I mean, she's got this life going on. So Abner and these men go pounding on the door in the middle of the night. You know, this guy's putting on his robe and holding his little candle and cracking the door. And he says, is your wife Michal here? And he says, yeah, well, she's sleeping. Well, they push him out of the way, and they grab Michal out of bed, and they march her off. All the time he's following behind them, weeping, because they're taking the mother of his children and his wife. And she's taken back to David. Now you have to ask yourself, did David really love Michal? It's been all this time. Or is this another feather in David's cap to give him some legitimacy to the throne? But we find out a little bit later, there's a little bit of bitterness that goes on there that we see, if you remember with the story when he brings the ark into Jerusalem and he's dancing and she's just ashamed of him, and you know, it wasn't a real good marriage, but nevertheless, that's what happens. So he's a pretty smooth politician, and so Abner delivers Michal and goes back and starts talking to all the tribal leaders about coming under David. And they're listening. Everybody respects David, and they certainly respect Abner. And if Abner's going with David, well, then maybe we should go with David. And so he's getting David all kinds of support. But word gets back to Jahab that, dude, you're about to lose your job. He's promised Abner that Abner's going to take the command, and you're going to get demoted down to colonel or something, and you're going to be working for Abner. And that didn't set right with Joab. As I said, he'd been the general of David's forces since the very beginning. He's been very loyal to David. So he goes out to find Abner, to congratulate Abner on his new promotion, and as is customary, to give the Middle Eastern hug, and embraces him, and while he does that, he shoves his dagger into his belly and he kills Abner. Well, I mean, that puts everything on the back burner. So now Abner, who is this well-respected and loved leader throughout Israel, gets killed by one of David's men. So what does David do? Well, the first thing he does is he writes another great lament. David was a good writer. He wrote 73 of the Psalms, right? So he writes another lament about Abner, and he circulates that throughout the land, and then he orchestrates this huge state funeral for Abner. And he doesn't actually punish Joab, but he makes him wear sackcloth and ashes, and he and his men have to walk with their head hung in front of the procession, almost as if saying, well, this was some kind of a mistake left over from the Civil War, and now he's really ashamed of what happened, and so the people buy it, and so they're moved by David's respect for Abner. They were moved by this diatribe that he writes, about him, this lament. They're moved by his loyalty to the house of Saul, and so the 11 tribes go with it, and David is crowned king of all Israel. So this is 7.5 years after Saul died at Gilboa. So he was king in just Judah for that 7.5 years before it finally comes to fruition, and David becomes king of all the tribes. And so the people are pleased with David's grief. The damage control was pretty effective, was a brilliant political move. He didn't really trust Abner anyway, so now he's got his trusted general Joab in charge of his armies, and he's a commander of the army, and he's pretty much taking care of all of his problems, with the exception of Ishbosheth, because Ishbosheth is still the rightful heir to the throne. Now, when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we're going to get there, we're not going to have time to go through all of the kings, but you'll see it in this. But it's customary in this during this time that when you took over as king, you killed everybody whoever you took the crown from. You killed everybody in their family, because you wanted to do away with anybody who had a rightful place to take that throne. David's never done that. David has always protected the house of Saul. So at the end of the chapter, you find David giving his inaugural speech, and he is saying, well, you know what, I'm the king now, and we're all together, and now finally Israel's one big nation, and we still have enemies. Don't forget we have enemies, and we have to take care of our enemies. Well, 2 of Ishbosheth's captains take that as, okay, we got our marching orders. So they go back to Ishbosheth, and they assassinate him. And they come back to David and said, your problems are taken care of. You do not have, there's no one else that can take the throne. So what does David do? He chops off the head of the captains that took Ishbosheth's life and said, hey, I'm assassinating them for killing an anointed king. So once again, David's hands are completely clean. All of the competition is gone. All of his people are in place, and there's a king in Israel. The next thing David does is his capital, remember, is in Hebron, which is in the center of Judah, but Judah is down in the south. And so he thinks that, well, that's not ideal. So just like when the 13 colonies formed, remember after the Continental Congress, they had the capital was in Philadelphia. Well, once the Revolutionary War ended and it was time to get these states to come together, it was Jefferson's idea that said we really can't have a capital in the north or the capital in the south, and that's why they created the District of Columbia. It was right in the center of the 13 colonies, and it wasn't a colony, it wasn't a state, and so it was supposed to be a kind of a neutral thing. So David does the same thing. He says, I got to pick another capital. There just happens to be this great fortified city, has an underground, up on a hill, has an underground water source. It's already fortified, and it's right in the center between the north and the south. Unfortunately, it's inhabited by other people, so he invades it, and he takes over Jerusalem, and he makes Jerusalem his capital. And he goes on from there, and one of the first things he does, which just captures the heart of the people, is he invades and he completely defeats the Philistines. Because, remember, he fought with them for 10 years. He knew all their tactics and strategy. So he goes in and he takes out the Philistines. Well, when he does that, remember when we were talking about the different enemies that Israel had, and I said that the Philistines were a real force to be reckoned with. Remember that Dan got part of that property, and they were too big. They couldn't take them out. So Dan ended up going to the north and finding other property with people that was easier to kill, I guess. So the Philistines had 5 major cities along the Villamara, along the trade route. Well, now David controls those. So David controls all of the trade route from the Villamara and the King's Highway, and then the narrative tells us that he goes on to make a treaty with the king of Tyre, because Tyre was were located right on the coast, and in what's modern day southern Lebanon now, but they controlled the waterways. So now he has this treaty with Tyre, and between the king of Tyre and David, they control the entire distribution center for the civilized world. Egypt is still the breadbasket for the world, but Egypt can't move their goods without cooperating with David. And so now the wealth starts to roll in, and Israel actually, because he fights other battles, he gains more territory, he can fund all of that. And then his next step is he goes and gets the ark. Now remember the ark was at Nob, and Saul had all the priests killed, and so they moved it to Gibeon. Well, he goes to Gibeon, he gets the ark, and he brings it to Jerusalem. And so they rebuild the tabernacle in Jerusalem, and so now Jerusalem is not only the political capital of Israel, it is the religious capital of Israel, and David controls all of it. So he was a brilliant politician, he was a brilliant tactician, a military commander, most of the time a man of God. And so he's very successful and very respected as a king. So one day he's holding court and he asks, he's got complete control, but you got to keep control. So one day David asks, hey, is there anybody else from Saul's household that we don't know about that I could be a blessing to? And sure enough, there is a grandson. There's a grandson of Saul, son of Jonathan, named Mephibosheth. And he's a young man at this point. He's crippled in one foot because he was 5 years old when Saul was killed at Mount Gilboa, and when his nanny found out that Saul was dead, she picked up the little boy, and in her haste to escape, she dropped him. He broke his foot, never grew back right, and so he's lame in one foot, and he's been in hiding because that's what you do if you're the family of the past king. Well, somebody rats him out, and so David says, well, bring him to me. And so Mephibosheth comes to David. He's brought to David trembling because he figures he knows what's going to happen. David embraces Mephibosheth, tells him he's adopted as a son. He'll eat at the king's table for the rest of his life. His property will be protected. And he brings Mephibosheth into his family. Now, you got to ask yourself, did David do that because of the promise that he made to Jonathan to care for Jonathan's family? Or did he do that because you keep your friends close and your enemies closer? I think the answer is yes. I think probably both of those things. And so Mephibosheth goes on to live on with David. Well, a time of success goes for quite some time. David is a well-respected king. He's been king for some time now. He's approaching 50 years old. He's probably late 40s now. And then we pick up the famous story in 2 Samuel. And that we pick that up in 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 through 17. And it's a pretty short account, but we've all heard about it a million times. But I'll read that account. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. but David remained at Jerusalem. And it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw on the roof a woman a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanliness, so she had just had her menstrual period, and she's bathing, and that's an important point to make here because of the next statement. And then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I'm pregnant." So there's no doubt whose baby this is. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah came to him, David asked, how's it going out there? How's the people doing? How's Joab? How's the war going? Sounds like general chit-chat to me. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And that's a euphemism. And Uriah went out to the king's house, and he followed him with a present from the king. So he was followed with a dozen roses, a bottle of champagne, and some lingerie or something. So they're following Uriah, but Uriah doesn't go home. And Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. And when they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "Have you not come from a long journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, and I want you to catch this, he says, "The ark of Israel and Judah dwell in the booths, and my lord Joab," he doesn't say my lord David, he says my lord Joab and his servants, and the servants of my lord, "are camping in the open field. Shall I then go down to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today and also tomorrow, and I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and David invited him, and he ate in his presence, and he drank, so that he made him drunk, thinking now he'll surely go home. And in the evening he went out to lie on the couch with his servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, "Send Uriah to the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew that valiant men. And when the men of the city came out to fight with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell, Uriah the Hittite was also dead. First of all, I know that there's a lot made about David being in Jerusalem, that this was a time when all kings go to war. And I know that I've heard whole sermons on that. But to be fair, if you go back in the narrative again and you read the whole of the story, David was almost killed, if you might remember, by one of Goliath's sons. And his soldiers got in the way and killed that giant. But then they called David to the side and said, "Dude, you can't keep doing this. You're approaching 50 years old. You can't keep going into battle. If you die, we're going to lose all of Israel. And so you need to stay back, and you need to let us, you're becoming a liability to us." Now, it does say David was laying on the couch. Maybe he should have been golfing or something, or finding something to do, right? You got to retire to something. But I don't know. I don't think the issue is just that David was left behind. I think he was, because that was a season in his life, and it's a season. My wife and I were just talking about this today. We all have to adjust to different seasons in our life. But it is interesting to me that, do you think maybe that Uriah had a feeling what had happened here? I mean, who calls he's not a general, he's just a colonel or something. Who calls somebody back and just asks some chit-chat questions about how the battle's going, and then encourages them right away to go home? And you got to wonder if somebody might have even said, hey, you know, we saw your wife coming in and out of the palace. I mean, that would have been something that people would have noticed. Joab, to me, seems like, I mean, you know, I know when I was deployed on hurricanes and stuff, if I was gone a long time and I came home and I didn't dilly-dally at the airport, I got home to see my wife. Joab doesn't do that. And I have to wonder if that's not out of hurt and anger. But at any rate, David didn't only have Uriah killed. The narrative tells us that a number of his soldiers perished in that battle. And so David takes care of it the way he thinks he should take care of it, and he just goes on and never really admits to himself what he did, and he goes on with his life. And then we run into that, I'm sure Bathsheba knew what happened too. I mean, shortly after this, you know, staff car pulls up and the officer gets out with the chaplain and knocks on your door. I mean, she's got to know that whole thing was orchestrated. So now she's taken into David's home. He takes her as his wife and goes on and thinks he's going to live happily ever after until he's holding court one day and Nathan comes to him, one of the prophets, and says, hey, I have a court case for you. There's a poor man. He had one lamb. And he cared for the lamb, and he slept with the lamb, and he loved the lamb, and he fed the lamb. There was another man. He was rich, and he had a number of lambs. And when it came time to slaughter a lamb for a guest, he didn't take one of his own. He took the one from the poor man. And David is livid and immediately says, well, that man deserves to die. And there was those famous words when Nathan said, and you are the man. And it's very interesting that once David came face to face with what he had done, he immediately repents. And he's immediately forgiven. But there's consequences to that sin. The child of Bathsheba dies. And not only that, later, when David wants to build the temple, God tells him he has too much blood on his hands. David takes that, and he says later that, well, I've done many battles. Those battles were sanctioned. This battle was not. And it's interesting. It wasn't the adultery that God withhold that from. He would have forgiven him for that. And he did. It was this spilled blood. Remember when Cain killed Abel and God said, his blood is crying to me from the ground. And so David's a complicated individual, to be sure. Well, he repents and the child dies, and you know we just talked about what happens down the road. And as I said, he's a great warrior. He's a competent leader in most cases. In most of the time, I think he's a man of God. He was a horrible father, though. He was a terrible father. We don't know how many sons David had. He had a lot of sons. We don't know how many. But we do know he had one daughter. Her name was Tamar, and she was a beautiful young lady. And so David's oldest son, Amnon, he was infatuated with his half-sister. And he lures her into his bedroom under the pretense of being ill, and he rapes her. Well, David finds out about it and doesn't do anything. Never addressed it. Absalom, who was Tamar's blood brother, finds out about it too, and he's livid, not only at Amnon, but there's all this animosity that's building up because David didn't do anything about it. What do you think would have happened if somebody would have raped David's sister? And he's beside himself as to why David isn't acting. And so he takes, matters into his own hands. He holds this big banquet. He invites all of his brothers, and he kills Amnon. That's a capital offense, so he escapes to a sanctuary city that's actually ruled by his grandfather. And he's there for about 3 years before David's men come to him and say, look, Amnon is dead. Absalom is heir to the throne. You got to bring him back. So David allows Absalom to come back and Absalom has built up a lot of support while he's been gone. And he's very bitter. But he comes back to Jerusalem, and now David has an opportunity to mend that bridge, but he doesn't do it. He doesn't even let Absalom come into his presence. And so more and more resentment is built up, and eventually what happens is Absalom actually forms a coup and gets enough support and tries to take the government away from David. Without a shot being fired, David has to escape Jerusalem. And that's a whole very interesting story, and you can read all about that. Eventually, Absalom is overrun. That's the famous story about when he escapes. David doesn't want Absalom hurt because that's his son. Go to war and kill everybody, but don't kill Absalom. And then he gets his hair caught in a mulberry tree. So I think it says an oak, and King James Version was a mulberry tree. And he's hanging there, and then he's killed. They slaughter him. And so the word gets back to David, and David goes into this big lament, and he's crying, and he's Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son, and he won't wash, and he won't eat, and he's wearing sackcloth, and he's crying and whining in his bed, and finally Joab comes and kicks the bedroom door in and says, "Get up and wash your face and get back on your throne. What is the matter with you? These men risked their life to get your kingdom back, and now they're walking around thinking that they did something wrong. You're acting like you're ashamed of them. If you want a kingdom, then act like a king." I love it because I think everybody needs somebody that'll kick their door in and talk to them like a Dutch uncle now and then. Don't we all need that? Somebody to just be honest and that has the courage to call us on, how we're acting. Well, David listens to Joab. He gets up, washes his face, takes his place on the throne. David grows in years. He gets old. He's getting quite feeble, and it's getting to the end of his days. And everybody starts to notice that. And David's oldest son that is left now, because Amnon was killed by Absalom was killed by Joab. So now the next in line is Adonijah. And Adonijah comes and says, well, you know what? He's old, he's feeble. I think it's time I took the throne. So he contacts Joab for one of his the commander of the army. And that makes sense to Joab. I mean, David's getting pretty old. And he gets the high priest, and he has this big banquet, and he invites all of his brothers. Well, not all of his brothers. Most of his brothers. Not the little brother. And so he invites them all, and he is going to claim himself king of Israel. Well, Nathan hears about it. Nathan goes to Bathsheba and tells Bathsheba, you better go see David and tell him what's happening. So Bathsheba goes to see David, and she says, now this is Pastor Carlism, right? But because I have to ad-lib, I can't, So she comes to him and says, do you remember when we were having that romantic moment, and we were talking pillow talk, and you promised me that my son Solomon would take the throne when it was time? And David said, yeah, I remember that. And he says, well, your son Adonijah is now holding a feast, and he's claiming the throne for himself. And so David summons Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaniah, who's one of the mighty men, and he says, go get Solomon, put the royal robes on him, put him on my donkey, parade him through Jerusalem, anoint him and crown him king, put him on my throne, and say, long live King Solomon, and I will write the edict that says he is taking my place. And that's what happened. And so when Adonijah finds out what's happening, he runs into the tabernacle, grabs the altar, and hangs onto that altar, begging for his life. And so Solomon tells him, well, you know what, if you keep your nose clean and you stay out of trouble and you stay out of my hair, you'll live. It doesn't work out that way. We'll find out more about that next week. So we now have a new king in Israel, and that's King Solomon. David is a really difficult character to understand. And I was really thinking about this. We all know David as a man after God's own heart, don't we? We hear about that all the time, and God says that. He speaks of David that way throughout antiquity. But when you read the account, it's kind of difficult to see that. And as I was studying it, I thought to myself, we don't really know people like we think we do. I was thinking, people don't really know me. It's said a lot when you come up in the fire service that you spend more time with your crew than you do with your family, because you're with them. You work with them 24 hours a day, but you're never apart because you're working as a team all of the time. And so you think they know you very well. And if you were to ask, the guys that I worked with, you hear two sides of the story, obviously. You would hear, I got the, I was the firefighter of the year a couple of times. I got the Distinguished Service Medal. So some of those guys would say Carl is, real dedicated, and some of those guys would say, yeah, he's just a company man, does whatever the chief wants him to do. I got the Medal of Valor twice. Some of those guys would say, yeah, he's really aggressive, and other guys would say, he's nuts, he's going to get us killed, he takes too many risks. It depends on, it does, right? It depends on their look. But they never really knew me. Those guys didn't see me sobbing when I couldn't save a little girl. They never saw my hand shaking after I fell through 3 stories and ended up in a basement. I was fine, but they didn't see my hand shake every time I went on a run for about a month after that. I never disclosed any of that to them. That was stuff that happened in here. And when we read the account of David, we see a politician, we see a warrior, we see a king. But when we get to the Psalms, as I said earlier, there are 150 Psalms, and David wrote 73 of those. And many of those you can go back and you can take that Psalm and you can place it right in the narrative that is going on in 2 Samuel. And you see a side of David that nobody would have seen except God. And God chose to introduce him to us by putting it in his word. And so David was a man after his own heart, but he was flawed. He was complicated, just like all of us. And he's a tough guy, but and not always righteous. But as we go forward in the narrative, we'll see Israel was pretty fortunate to have David as a king, because it doesn't get a whole lot better. So when we pick up next week, we'll take a look at King Solomon, and we'll look at his reign and then see what happens as a result of the legacy that he leaves. Any questions, comments at all? Steve? I'm just kidding. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll dismiss. Heavenly Father, thank you for the example of David, but thank you for the example that you set. That when David was unfaithful, you remained faithful. And we see that throughout Scripture, but it's so evident in the life of this man. And it gives us so much hope when we see all the areas that we have fallen short. And yet you see our hearts, and you see the willingness to obey. I think of Paul, who said, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I do, I don't want to do. And we all struggle that way, and yet, Father, you see our sins as far as the east is from the west. And we're so grateful for that example. It is in the precious name of Jesus Christ that we thank you today. Amen. Thank you, folks.